Detective Agatha Marple. The Lost Jewel on the Atlantic Ocean Liner. A Detective Tales. The first rays of dawn spilled across the busy docks of Southampton, painting the water with streaks of gold and copper. The towering figure of the SS Illusion loomed over the scene like a floating cathedral, its sleek hull glistening with an almost arrogant elegance. Steam hissed from unseen valves, blending with the shouts of porters and the occasional whistle of a train delivering the last of the morning passengers. It was a symphony of movement and sound, chaotic yet oddly orchestrated. Among the throng stood Detective Agatha Marple, a figure easily overlooked amidst the colourful bustle of the crowd. Dressed in a modest travelling suit of sensible grey and a matching hat with a discreet feather, she clutched a leather handbag that seemed almost an extension of herself. Her sharp eyes, though partially obscured by steel-rimmed glasses, missed nothing. She paused at the foot of the gangway, tilting her head back to survey the grand vessel with a faint smile that carried equal parts admiration and skepticism. A palace afloat, she murmured to herself, though her tone suggested she found the boast faintly ridiculous. Yet there was something thrilling about the grandeur of it all, even for someone as unassuming as Miss Marple. As she began her ascent, the smell of salt and coal lingered in the brisk morning air, mingling with the perfume of well-dressed passengers and the metallic tang of luggage carts clattering over uneven cobblestones. Behind her, a porter struggled under the weight of an oversized trunk belonging to a woman in an elaborate fur stall, whose clipped commands carried above the general din. "Really, George, do hurry. One would think you were carrying a piano," the woman snapped, casting a disdainful glance at the struggling man. Marple stepped lightly aside to let them pass, her lips twitching in what could have been amusement or disapproval, it was difficult to say. Inside the SS Elysian, the grand foyer opened up like a stage set for a play, its polished brass railings catching the light of crystal chandeliers that swayed ever so slightly with the rhythm of the ship. The marble floor gleamed underfoot, its intricate mosaic pattern a subtle nod to the ship's opulence. Passengers milled about, some clutching boarding passes while others stood in small clusters, their conversations forming a low hum of anticipation. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the crowd, observing with the quiet detachment of someone accustomed to being an outsider. Her gaze swept over the room, noting details others might miss: the scuffed heel of a well-dressed man whose gait betrayed an old injury, the overly bright smile of a steward smoothing over a passenger's complaint, the faintly nervous laugh of a young woman clinging too tightly to her husband's arm. "Ah, the human comedy," she murmured, before making her way to the purser's desk to confirm her cabin. As she handed over her ticket, she caught the tail end of a conversation between a tall man with a neatly trimmed moustache and the ship's purser. "The Ashburn family suite, yes. And do ensure their valuables are handled with the utmost discretion," the man said, his voice low but firm. The purser nodded. "Of course, Mr. Carruthers. Everything has been arranged." The name sparked a flicker of recognition in Miss Marple's mind. The Ashbourne family. She recalled the society pages mentioning their precarious finances, and the recent announcement of a dazzling exhibition aboard the Elysian, a certain sapphire of extraordinary size and value, dubbed the vanishing jewel of the Atlantic. A bold choice, she thought, given their rumoured troubles. As Carruthers turned, their eyes met briefly. He offered a polite nod, but Marple sensed something guarded in his expression. She responded with a demure smile and moved on, mentally filing the encounter away. After settling into her cabin, a comfortable but unremarkable space with a porthole that framed the morning sea, Miss Marple decided to take a turn on the promenade deck. The brisk air was invigorating, and the ship's gentle sway beneath her feet was almost soothing. She was admiring the view when a steward appeared beside her, as if conjured by the wind. He was young, with a face that might have been pleasant, if not for the shadow of unease that darkened it. He hesitated before speaking, twisting his cap in his hands. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he began, his voice barely audible above the wind. "But you're the lady detective, aren't you? The one they write about in the papers?" Miss Marple regarded him with mild surprise. "I wouldn't say they write about me," she said with a modest laugh. "But yes, I've been known to assist with the odd puzzle or two." The steward glanced over his shoulder before leaning in. "There's talk below deck, ma'am, about that sapphire being aboard. Some say it's cursed, and others—" He hesitated, his face pale. "Others say someone means to steal it." "Do they now?" Miss Marple's tone was light, but her gaze sharpened. "And what do you think?" The young man swallowed. I think there's too much at stake. For the family. For everyone." He glanced around nervously. "You'd do well to keep an eye open, ma'am." "That's all I'll say." Before she could press him further, the steward tipped his cap and vanished into the bustle of passengers. Miss Marple remained by the rail, her expression thoughtful as she gazed out at the horizon. "A cursed sapphire, is it?" she murmured to herself. "How very dramatic. But then again, the truth often is." She lingered a moment longer, letting the salty breeze tease at her hat, before turning back toward the ship's interior. As she walked, the gleaming corridors and polished brass seemed to hold a faintly menacing edge, as if the opulence concealed shadows waiting to emerge. Miss Marple boards the SS Elysian with the hope of a peaceful voyage, but the whispers of a cursed sapphire, the guarded faces of its passengers, and the faint air of tension suggest otherwise. The stage is set, the piece is in motion, and the detective's sharp mind already at work, even if she insists she is merely a retired lady on holiday. The heavy mist clung stubbornly to the docks of Southampton, swirling around the ankles of porters as they bustled about, hefting trunks and valises onto towering gangways. The low wail of a ship's horn reverberated through the air, mingling with the shouted orders of deckhands and the clipped exchanges of well-dressed passengers. Amid this scene of orchestrated chaos, the SS Elysian stood like a queen among her subjects, a magnificent ocean liner poised to carry its privileged cargo across the Atlantic. At the edge of the throng stood Miss Agatha Marple, unassuming in a sensible grey travelling suit, and a modest hat pinned at just the right angle. She gripped her leather handbag, the only luggage she deemed necessary for a simple holiday. Her sharp, discerning eyes took in the spectacle before her, lingering on small details that might escape the notice of most. A porter struggled to maneuver a particularly unwieldy trunk onto the gangway, his muttered curses muffled by the din. From nearby, an imperious voice cut through the morning air. "Careful with that, man. It's a family heirloom." The speaker, a man in his 60s with a pinched expression and an immaculate suit, gestured sharply as if directing a stage play. Beside him stood a woman swathed in furs, her gloved hand clutching a bejeweled handbag. Behind them, a young woman trailed, her head tilted just slightly, the brim of her cloche hat casting a shadow over her downturned face. The Ashburn family. Miss Marple recognized them from the society pages. Lord Henry Ashburn, his wife Lady Edith, and their daughter Miss Cordelia Ashburn. The family was rumored to be teetering on the brink of financial ruin, their fortune having dwindled through a combination of poor investments and extravagant living. And yet there they stood, every inch the picture of upper-class refinement, as if determined to deny the whispers. "Quite the theatrical display," Miss Marple murmured to herself, lips curving in a faint smile. She noted the glint of anxiety in Lady Edith's eyes as she glanced at the trunk, a flicker so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant. The object of her concern, Miss Marple knew, was the family's last great treasure, the vanishing jewel of the Atlantic. A sapphire of extraordinary size and clarity, it was to be exhibited during the voyage as part of a gala meant to raise funds or, as some speculated, salvage the Ashburn's fading reputation. Miss Marple ascended the gangway with deliberate steps, pausing briefly to glance down at the milling crowd below. She observed a young couple bickering over a mislaid ticket, a child crying as his mother hurriedly wiped his face, and a trio of businessmen in animated discussion. The scene below was lively, almost comforting in its normalcy. Yet aboard the SS Elysian, the atmosphere felt charged, as if unseen forces were already at play. Once aboard, she stepped into the ship's grand foyer, a dazzling expanse of polished wood and gleaming brass. Chandeliers hung from high ceilings, casting soft golden light over the mosaic-patterned floor. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers and the faint tang of sea salt. Passengers moved through the space with varying degrees of self-importance, some pausing to admire the opulent surroundings, others striding purposefully toward the purser's desk. Miss Marple stood to one side, taking it all in. She caught snippets of conversation as guests passed by, a boast about business ventures, a complaint about the weather, and most interestingly a whispered remark about the sapphire. "It's cursed, you know," said one woman to her companion, her voice low but fervent. "Every family who's owned it has met with tragedy." Her companion laughed nervously. "Oh, come now, that's just talk. Surely the Ashburns wouldn't have brought it aboard if there were any truth to that. Miss Marple's ears pricked. She made a mental note to keep an eye on both women. Those who whispered about curses were often the first to act on them. It was not long before the Ashburns made their appearance in the foyer, flanked by their attendants. Lord Ashburn held his head high, his movements as precise as his tailored suit. Lady Edith trailed just behind, her lips pressed into a tight line, as if the very act of maintaining composure required immense effort. Miss Cordelia Ashbourne, however, was another story. While her parents exuded carefully practiced poise, Cordelia moved with a nervous energy, her gloved hands clasping and unclasping the strap of her handbag. Her eyes darted about the room, lingering briefly on each face before flitting to the next. "Quite the menagerie," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze following Cordelia's. The young woman's unease was palpable, though whether it stemmed from shyness or something more sinister she could not yet say. As the family passed, Miss Marple stepped discreetly aside, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Lord Ashburn's voice carried as he addressed one of the stewards. "I trust the arrangements have been made," he said, his tone clipped. "Yes, my lord," the steward replied, bowing slightly. "The exhibit case has been installed in the Grand Salon, and security measures are in place." "Good," Lord Ashbourne said, though he did not sound entirely convinced. Lady Edith cast a nervous glance toward her husband but said nothing. Cordelia, meanwhile, had stopped abruptly, staring out one of the large porthole windows as if lost in thought. When her mother called her name sharply, she started and hurried to catch up. Miss Marple watched them disappear down the corridor, her expression thoughtful. As the final call for boarding echoed through the ship, passengers rushed to their cabins or found their places along the rails to wave farewell. Miss Marple chose a spot near the stern, where she could observe without being observed. The horn sounded again, long and mournful, as the gangway was raised and the ship began to move. Bellow. The crowd on the dock waved hats and handkerchiefs, their cheers growing faint as the distance between them and the vessel widened. The water churned white against the hull, and the mist seemed to part reluctantly, as if unwilling to release the ship into open waters. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow ascent. There was a faint smile on her lips, but her thoughts were already elsewhere on the Ashburns, the Saphire, and the undercurrent of tension she had sensed aboard the SS Elysian. It was, she thought, a most intriguing way to begin her holiday. With a final glance at the receding shore, she adjusted her hat and made her way toward the promenade deck, the faint strains of a string quartet drifting through the air as the ship sailed into what promised to be anything but a peaceful journey. The groundwork is laid, the characters introduced, and the mystery seeded with subtle hints of danger. The SS Elysian is not just a setting, but a microcosm of ambition, secrecy, and the shadowy allure of wealth, all ripe for a clever detective like Miss Marple to unravel. The SS Elysian had earned its reputation as a floating palace, a modern marvel that married engineering prowess with unabashed luxury. Its grand foyer, the beating heart of the ship, was nothing short of spectacular. A sweeping staircase, its railings polished to a golden sheen, curved down to meet the expanse of a gleaming mosaic floor. Above, an intricate crystal chandelier reflected the soft amber light of the afternoon, casting delicate patterns that danced like lace across the walls. Everywhere one looked there was movement, guests drifting in with their champagne flutes, porters rushing discreetly with luggage, and stewards gliding through the crowd, balancing trays of canapes. Miss Agatha Marple, standing just within the entrance, adjusted her gloves with quiet precision. Her expression was that of a woman entirely at ease, though her eyes moved with quick efficiency, noting the details others overlooked. To the untrained observer, she was just another middle-aged spinster admiring the ship's grandeur, but to those who knew her reputation, she was far more formidable than her modest demeanour suggested. The air hummed with excitement for the transatlantic crossing, and the polite murmur of conversation ebbed and flowed around her. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a scene that spoke not only of wealth, but also of the undercurrent of self-importance wealth so often encouraged. She found herself faintly amused. A ripple passed through the crowd as Lord and Lady Ashbourne entered, their presence as polished as their reputations. Lord Ashbourne, tall and distinguished, exuded an air of authority that came naturally to men accustomed to being obeyed. His sharp grey suit was immaculate, though Miss Marple noted the faintest wear at the cuffs, perhaps an indication that his fortune wasn't quite as robust as appearances suggested. Beside him, Lady Ashbourne moved with practised grace, her fair stole draped across her shoulders like armour. Her face, pale but serene, betrayed little of her inner thoughts, though her gloved hand tightened on the strap of her bejewelled handbag as they descended the stairs. Trailing a step behind was their daughter, Miss Cordelia Ashbourne, who appeared every bit the modern young woman in her ivory cloche hat and fitted travelling coat. Yet there was something tentative in her movements, a hesitancy that hinted at a nervous disposition. Her eyes darted across the foyer as if searching for something. Or someone. Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. Families like the Ashbournes did not carry themselves with such precise choreography unless there was something to hide. Her lips curved in a small smile, the kind that could be mistaken for idle amusement, but in truth it was the smile of a detective who had just glimpsed the first thread of a mystery. As the Ashbournes reached the base of the staircase, they were met by Captain Townsend, a man whose crisp navy uniform and silver-embellished cap seemed to add inches to his already impressive stature. He greeted the family with a warmth that was, to Miss Marple's ears, slightly over-rehearsed. "Lord Ashbourne, Lady Ashbourne, Miss Cordelia," the captain said, his voice smooth and sonorous. "A pleasure to welcome you aboard the Elysian. I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction." Lord Ashbourne extended a hand, his smile thin but polite. "Thank you, Captain. I'm certain we shall, though I trust the arrangements for our exhibit have been made with the utmost care." "Of course," Captain Townsend replied, his expression calm, though his gaze flickered ever so slightly toward Lady Ashbourne. "The grand salon is being prepared as we speak. Security measures have been thoroughly reviewed." "Good." Lord Ashbourne's tone was clipped, his hand resting on the rail of the staircase as though to steady himself. "We can't be too careful with a treasure of such importance." The exchange might have seemed ordinary to most, but Miss Marple caught the faint tension between the two men. It was not the natural tension of strangers making small talk, but something deeper, laden with unspoken concern. And then there was Lady Ashbourne, who avoided meeting the captain's eyes entirely, her gaze fixed somewhere over his shoulder. Miss Marple, ever the picture of unobtrusiveness, moved to a nearby alcove where a steward was arranging a bouquet of fresh flowers. She adjusted her position slightly, ensuring she had a clear view of the Ashbournes as they continued their conversation. It was then that Miss Cordelia, who had lingered at the foot of the stairs, seemed to sense the weight of Miss Marple's gaze. Their eyes met, and for the briefest moment Miss Marple saw a flicker of something in the young woman's expression. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a carefully neutral smile, but the impression lingered. Cordelia turned away and joined her parents, her movements brisk, as though she were eager to escape whatever had unsettled her. Together, the family disappeared into the crowd, their figures swallowed by the swirl of passengers and porters. Miss Marple sighed, adjusting the strap of her handbag. "Families are such peculiar things," she murmured to herself. "And the more they try to keep their secrets, the harder it becomes." The orchestra struck up a lively tune as more passengers poured into the foyer, their laughter and chatter filling the space. Waiters moved among them with trays of champagne, the clinking of glasses adding to the symphony of sounds. Yet for all its vibrancy, the grand foyer seemed to Miss Marple like a stage awaiting its inevitable drama. As she made her way toward the promenade deck for a breath of fresh air, the faint strains of a nearby conversation caught her attention. Two gentlemen in dark suits stood by a marble pillar, speaking in low voices. "They're saying it's cursed," one murmured, his tone conspiratorial. "The Ashbourne sapphire, I mean. Every owner's met with misfortune. Superstition," the other replied dismissively, though he sounded, "Still, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Bringing it aboard, I mean. Almost tempting fate." Miss Marple paused at the threshold of the deck, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She did not turn to look at the men, nor did she linger long enough to hear the rest of their exchange. It was not necessary. The seed of suspicion had already been planted, and she had every intention of watching it grow. As the Elysian began its slow departure from the dock, the ship's horn bellowed, a low and mournful sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Miss Marple stepped out onto the deck, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. There was a faint smile on her lips, but it did little to mask the glint of sharp intelligence in her eyes. Miss Marple observes the Ashbourne family with quiet precision, noting the subtle dynamics and unease surrounding them. The grandeur of the Elysian is juxtaposed with the undercurrent of tension, setting the stage for the intrigue to come. The chapter closes with foreshadowing whispers of misfortune, drawing the reader further into the mystery of the cursed sapphire and the secrets aboard the ship. The grand foyer of the SS Elysian was a theatre of splendour. Its brass rails gleamed like gold under the soft light of Art Deco's sconces, while the polished marble floor reflected every movement. A kaleidoscope of silk gowns, polished brogues, and flashes of jewels. A grand staircase arced upward in two symmetrical spirals, leading to the ship's upper decks, where first-class passengers drifted with an air of practised ease. At the periphery of this stage stood Miss Agatha Marple, her sensible travelling suit and modest hat a stark contrast to the finery around her, yet her presence, though unassuming, held an air of quiet authority. She stood as still as a statue, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag, her sharp eyes drinking in the scene. The foyer was alive with the hum of voices, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional clink of champagne glasses. A string quartet, stationed discreetly to one side, played a waltz that added an elegant undercurrent to the room's energy. "Quite the production," Miss Marple murmured under her breath, her voice tinged with amusement. To the casual observer, she appeared absorbed in the music, but in truth her mind was busy cataloguing details. The nervous smile of a steward rushing past, the hushed exchange between two gentlemen near the staircase, the way a certain young woman's hand trembled as she lifted a glass of champagne. At that moment the Ashbourne family entered the foyer, their arrival heralded by the rustle of expensive fabrics and the faint scent of lavender and cigars. Lord Henry Ashbourne, tall and silver-haired, led the way with a stride that spoke of years spent commanding respect. Yet to Miss Marple's discerning eye there was a stiffness in his shoulders, a man carrying a burden too heavy to conceal entirely. His grey suit was impeccably tailored, though its cut was conservative, as if to downplay any hint of extravagance. Behind him was Lady Edith Ashbourne, her fur stole draped over a shimmering green dress that caught the light with every movement. Her smile was carefully calibrated, warm enough to charm, but distant enough to discourage familiarity. She clutched her handbag tightly, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. Their daughter, Miss Cordelia Ashbourne, trailed a step behind, her youthful beauty framed by the soft curls that escaped her cloche hat. She moved with a quiet grace, but there was a restlessness in her eyes, as if she were searching for something or someone. The family descended the staircase with the precision of a royal procession, their every step choreographed to maintain appearances. As they reached the floor, a steward approached with a deferential bow, murmuring something that prompted a curt nod from Lord Ashbourne. Miss Marple observed the interaction with interest. There was an air of tension about the family, an unspoken weight that pressed down on their composed exteriors. It was not uncommon for the wealthy to carry their secrets like fine luggage, polished on the outside, locked tight within. But the Ashbournes' burdens seemed unusually heavy even for their station. As the Ashbournes moved deeper into the crowd, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a nearby conversation between two men standing partially obscured by a pillar. Their voices were low, but not so low that she couldn't catch fragments of their exchange. "Dreadful state, I hear. The estate's mortgaged to the hilt, and the daughter, poor girl, caught in the middle of it all. Tragic, isn't it? Though I hear they're banking everything on that sapphire." The last word hung in the air like a note of discord in the otherwise harmonious setting. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her expression serene but her mind sharp with interest. The vanishing jewel of the Atlantic, as it had been so dramatically named, was no ordinary trinket. Its fame and value were immense, and its presence aboard the Elysian had already sparked more whispers than champagne corks. Moving unobtrusively through the crowd, Miss Marple found herself a vantage point near a column adorned with brass filigree. From there she could watch the Ashbournes without drawing attention to herself. Lord Ashbourne stood in conversation with Captain Townsend, the ship's master, whose crisp navy uniform and genial demeanour marked him as a man accustomed to managing both storms and socialites. Their exchange was polite, but there was a tautness in Lord Ashbourne's posture that hinted at unspoken concerns. Lady Edith, meanwhile, lingered near the refreshments, her gloved fingers tracing absent patterns on the rim of her glass. Her gaze was fixed on the crowd, but her eyes seemed to look past the people around her as if her thoughts were far away. Miss Cordelia, however, was less composed. She drifted from group to group with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her movements lacking the ease of someone enjoying the festivities. When she paused near a window, her reflection showed a face taut with worry, though she quickly masked it when a gentleman approached. Miss Marple observed it all with quiet curiosity, filing each detail away like pieces of a puzzle. The Ashbournes, it seemed, were a family on the brink, not just financially but emotionally, and where such pressures existed, trouble was rarely far behind. A bell rang out, its clear chime cutting through the hum of conversation. Stewards moved through the room with efficiency, directing passengers to the muster stations for the mandatory safety drill. The crowd began to disperse, their chatter growing louder as they flowed toward the exits. Miss Marple followed the procession at a leisurely pace, her sensible heels clicking softly against the marble floor. As she passed the staircase, she caught a glimpse of Lord Ashbourne gesturing sharply toward his wife, his face momentarily stripped of its practiced composure. The exchange was brief, but the tension was unmistakable. The detective allowed herself a faint smile as she made her way to the promenade deck. The journey was only just beginning, but the stage had already been set. Secrets were stirring beneath the polished surface of the Elysian, and Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, was ready to uncover them. The grand salon of the SS Elysian shimmered with the kind of opulence that demanded admiration. Tall windows framed the darkening sky where the last traces of sunlight glimmered faintly on the horizon. Polished parquet floors gleamed like a mirror, reflecting the golden glow of crystal chandeliers. A small stage was set for the jazz trio, whose instruments glinted under soft spotlights, and the hum of anticipation mingled with the faint strains of a tune as they warmed up. Miss Agatha Marple, seated unobtrusively at a table near the edge of the room, sipped a cup of tea that had long since cooled. She observed the bustling scene with quiet interest, her eyes following the staff as they worked to set the stage for the evening's grand event. Velvet ropes were carefully arranged around a central display case that would soon hold the famed vanishing jewel of the Atlantic, a sapphire so large and rare it seemed more legend than reality. From her vantage point, Miss Marple could see Lord Henry Ashbourne standing near the display case and directing the preparations with the precision of a man accustomed to control. His grey suit was immaculate, but the tightness around his mouth betrayed a tension he worked hard to conceal. Every so often he glanced toward the room's entrance as if expecting, or dreading, someone's arrival. Across the room, Lady Edith Ashbourne, resplendent in an emerald gown that shimmered with every movement, drifted among the tables exchanging pleasantries with the high society guests. Her smile was gracious, her voice warm, yet to the practised observer there was an air of fragility about her. Miss Marple noted the way her gloved hands gripped her clutch a fraction too tightly, as though it were a lifeline. Trailing a step behind her mother was Miss Cordelia Ashbourne, who looked every bit the part of a young debutante in her silver dress and pearl necklace. Yet there was a shadow of unease in her eyes, a hesitance in her step. She greeted guests politely, but seemed distracted, her gaze flitting toward the display case as though drawn to it by some invisible force. Miss Marple's attention was drawn away by the arrival of Edward Pike, a tall, impeccably dressed gentleman with sharp features and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He moved through the room with the ease of someone who belonged but didn't necessarily care to be noticed. His presence, however, was difficult to ignore. There was a subtle air of watchfulness about him, as though he were cataloguing the guests with the same efficiency that Miss Marple herself employed. When Pike reached Miss Marple's table, he paused, inclining his head in greeting. "A splendid evening, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Though I suppose for some it's the sort of night that might invite complications." Miss Marple regarded him with mild curiosity. "Complications, Mr. Pike?" He smiled faintly. "A gem like that sapphire has a way of attracting the wrong sort of attention. Desperation, greed, envy. It's a dangerous mix, wouldn't you agree?" Her lips curved in a faint smile. "Oh, I dare say human nature has been far more dangerous than any jewel ever could be. A sapphire, after all, cannot scheme." Pike chuckled softly, his gaze flickering toward the display case. "True enough, Miss Marple, but schemes, I think, are already in motion." As Pike moved on, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the Ashbournes. Lord Ashbourne now stood beside the display case, his posture rigid as he inspected the final arrangements. The steward approached him with a clipboard, and the two exchanged a few quiet words before Lord Ashbourne nodded sharply. Lady Ashbourne, meanwhile, had drifted toward her husband, her expression carefully composed. "Henry," she murmured, her voice just loud enough to reach Miss Marple's ears. "Are we certain this is wise? Putting the sapphire on display? It feels like a gamble." Lord Ashbourne didn't look at her as he replied. "It's necessary, Edith. You know that. This exhibition is as much about confidence as it is about charity. We must show strength." "But what if—" She stopped herself, glancing nervously at the crowd. "What if something goes wrong?" Lord Ashbourne's jaw tightened. "Nothing will go wrong. The case is secure, and Townsend has assured me the ship's security is vigilant. Now please, try not to look so anxious. We mustn't give anyone reason to suspect weakness." Lady Ashbourne's lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded, though the tension in her shoulders remained. Miss Marple took a thoughtful sip of her tea. It was not the first time she had seen such a dynamic secret, an outwardly composed family shielding fractures beneath the surface. The Ashbournes were clearly burdened by more than the weight of their jewel, debt, scandal, perhaps even fear. All of it lingered beneath their polished exterior. A hush fell over the room as a steward stepped onto the stage, tapping a small brass bell to signal the start of the evening's program. The band ceased their warm-up, and the low hum of conversation gave way to attentive silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the steward began, his voice carrying over the room with practised clarity, "it is our great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's gala. In just a few moments, Lord Ashbourne will unveil the centerpiece of this evening's event, the vanishing jewel of the Atlantic." There was a ripple of excitement through the crowd, the kind of collective anticipation that electrified the air. Miss Marple noted the way several guests leaned forward in their seats, their eyes alight with curiosity, and, in some cases, avarice. As Lord Ashbourne stepped forward to address the guests, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander. She caught a fleeting glimpse of Edward Pike near the back of the room, his expression unreadable as he observed the proceedings. Across the salon, Lady Ashbourne clutched Cordelia's arm, her fingers white against the younger woman's silver sleeve. It was, Miss Marple thought, a tableau rich with tension and intrigue, and as Lord Ashbourne began his speech, she couldn't shake the feeling that the evening's drama was only just beginning. The grand salon of the SS Elysian had transformed into a stage worthy of its audience. The soft hum of chatter subsided as the room dimmed, leaving only the golden glow of a spotlight. It pooled on a small raised platform in the center of the room, where a velvet-draped pedestal stood in solemn anticipation. The air felt thick, charged with the kind of excitement that bordered on unease. Miss Agatha Marple, seated at the periphery, adjusted her glasses and observed the scene with quiet interest. Around her the glittering crowd leaned forward, their eyes glinting with curiosity, and in some cases, greed. In her experience, few things revealed human nature so plainly as a display of wealth, and tonight that wealth took the form of the vanishing jewel of the Atlantic, a sapphire so renowned it had already sparked countless rumours and twice as many ambitions. Lord Henry Ashbourne ascended the platform with deliberate steps, his bearing as stately as his tailored grey suit. He paused at the pedestal, one hand resting on the velvet covering. His expression was composed, though a flicker of something, nerves, perhaps, passed across his face before he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but measured, "it is both a privilege and an honour to share with you a treasure of exceptional beauty and history. This sapphire, known as the vanishing jewel of the Atlantic, has been in my family for generations. Its journey has been long, its legacy storied, and its value incalculable." A murmur rippled through the room. Some guests whispered excitedly, others simply stared at the pedestal, as if willing the gem to appear. Miss Marple noted the way Lady Ashbourne, seated near the front, clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. Lord Ashbourne's hand lingered on the velvet cloth for a moment longer, then pulled it away with a flourish. The sapphire was revealed. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The gem was immense, its deep blue facets catching the light in a way that made it seem almost alive. It shimmered with an inner fire, a hypnotic pulse that drew every gaze toward it. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. It was, she had to admit, a beautiful thing, but she was less interested in the sapphire itself than in the faces around her. Faces that reflected awe, envy, and in some cases poorly concealed calculation. As Lord Ashbourne continued his speech, extolling the jewel's craftsmanship and lineage, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander. She observed the room as a painter might study a canvas, noting every detail. Near the back of the crowd stood Edward Pike, his sharp features illuminated briefly as he shifted. His expression was unreadable, but there was something detached about the way he watched. Unlike the others, he didn't seem entranced by the sapphire. Instead, his gaze darted intermittently toward the room's exits. At one point, Pike slipped away, moving with a casualness that was almost too practiced. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. While others might have dismissed his departure as boredom or disinterest, she knew better. In her experience, such movements were rarely without purpose. The crowd's reaction to the sapphire had begun to splinter. Some murmured their admiration in hushed tones, while others whispered behind gloved hands. Lord Ashbourne, aware of the mounting tension, raised his voice slightly to regain their attention. "Of course," he said, "such a treasure comes with its share of responsibility. My family has always believed that beauty such as this must be shared, not hoarded, and so we have chosen to exhibit this jewel here on the Elysian as a symbol of hope, inspiration, and generosity." Miss Marple caught the faintest quirk of his lips as he spoke, a politician's smile, carefully practiced, but devoid of warmth. She wondered who the speech was truly meant to reassure, guests or himself. Nearby, a waiter stumbled slightly, his tray tilting precariously before he recovered. The moment passed quickly, but not before Miss Marple noticed the sharp look Lord Ashbourne cast in his direction. It was the look of a man already on edge, ready to interpret even the smallest misstep as a threat. As the speech concluded, the room erupted into polite applause. Lord Ashbourne stepped down from the platform, his face betraying a mix of relief and strain. The spotlight lingered on the sapphire, which now seemed to glow with an almost otherworldly intensity in the half-darkness. The applause was interrupted by the soft, lilting notes of a piano as the jazz trio began their set. The lights dimmed further, leaving the sapphire as the focal point. Shadows danced across the room, lending it an air of intimacy and unease. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The mood had shifted, the excitement of the unveiling giving way to something more ambiguous. The jewel, so luminous moments before, now seemed like a predator's eye, watching the room with silent menace. Somewhere in the dimness, Edward Pike had disappeared. Lady Ashbourne whispered something urgently to her husband, who shook his head sharply in response. And Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, sipped her tea and waited. Whatever drama the evening held, she knew it was only just beginning. The grand salon had reached its crescendo of glamour. The music from the jazz trio had become more spirited, laughter and conversation blended harmoniously, and champagne glasses clinked in rhythm with the light-hearted buzz of the evening. Yet beneath the glittering surface lay a tension, faint but tangible, like a note held too long in suspense. Miss Agatha Marple, seated near the back of the room, was content to observe. Bertie sat untouched on the table as her sharp eyes scanned the space. The sapphire gleamed from its velvet cushion at the centre of the room, encased in a glass display lit by a single dramatic spotlight. It shimmered like a living thing, its deep blue depths seeming to pulse in time with the distant hum of the ship's engines. Around it the guests had drifted into their own groups, admiring the jewel at intervals, but always keeping their distance. No one lingered too long, as though wary of drawing attention to themselves. Lord Ashbourne hovered near the display, his face calm but his movements taut. Lady Ashbourne and Cordelia remained seated at a nearby table, their conversation hushed. Edward Pike, Miss Marple noted, was nowhere to be seen. It happened so quickly that for a moment no one realized what was wrong. The overhead chandeliers flickered, casting the room into a strange half-light. A few nervous giggles broke the silence, but they were quickly swallowed by the collective murmur of unease. And then, with a final sputter, the lights failed entirely, plunging the salon into darkness. For several seconds, the only sounds were the faint creak of the ship and the hurried whispers of the guests. Someone dropped a glass, the sharp sound of shattering crystal breaking the stillness. "Stay calm, everyone," Lord Ashbourne's voice called out, firm but edged with tension. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes strained to adjust to the dim emergency lighting that flickered faintly from the corners of the room. A strange settled over her as she listened carefully, her sharp senses tuned to the faint movements in the dark. Then, as abruptly as they had gone out, the lights returned. The chandeliers blazed back to life, illuminating a scene of confusion. Guests glanced around with wide eyes, smoothing their hair and adjusting their clothing, as if to mask their disarray. But it was the sapphire that drew every gaze, or rather where the sapphire had been. The velvet cushion lay empty beneath the glass. The spotlight shone uselessly onto a hollow space. The vanishing jewel of the Atlantic had vanished indeed. For a moment the room was silent, the realization sinking in like a stone dropped into deep water. Then came the cries of alarm. Lady Ashbourne gasped, clutching at her chest as though the very breath had been stolen from her. Lord Ashbourne surged toward the display case, his face pale, his composure entirely shattered. "The jewel!" someone exclaimed, their voice high and strained. "It's gone!" A steward, who had been standing by the entrance, now stumbled onto the stage, his face ashen. "I saw someone," he stammered, pointing toward the far corner of the room. "A shadow, just before the lights came back. They must have taken it." "Impossible," Lord Ashbourne barked, his voice cracking. "This case was locked. Secure." Miss Marple rose from her seat, moving quietly through the stunned crowd. She paused near the display, her keen eyes scanning the glass case and the empty cushion beneath. A small detail caught her attention, a faint smudge on the edge of the glass, barely visible in the glaring light. Captain Townsend, summoned by the commotion, arrived swiftly. His uniformed presence added an air of authority to the chaos, and his booming voice cut through the rising panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must ask for calm," he said, raising his hands. "We will resolve this matter swiftly, but I must insist that no one leave the room until we have established what has happened." "Established?" Lord Ashbourne's voice was sharp with anger. "It's quite clear what has happened, Captain. Someone has stolen my family's sapphire. I demand action." The captain's gaze was steady. "And you shall have it, my lord, but we must proceed with care. A theft such as this, under such circumstances, requires a delicate touch." His words were met with murmurs of agreement from some and frustrated huffs from others. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood silently at the edge of the gathering, her expression thoughtful. She watched as the captain's eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on her. After a moment, Captain Townsend stepped toward her, lowering his voice. "Miss Marple, if I'm not mistaken, you have a certain talent for unraveling unusual situations?" She inclined her head modestly. "I do my best, Captain, though I fear I am but a retired lady enjoying a quiet holiday." His lips twitched in what might have been a faint smile. "Be that as it may, I suspect your insights would be invaluable. Might I trouble you to assist us in this matter?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained demure. "I should be delighted to help, Captain. After all," she added, her tone light, "such mysteries have a way of unraveling themselves in the most fascinating ways." As the guests were directed to remain in the salon, the atmosphere grew thick with suspicion. Eyes darted from one face to another, whispers flitted through the crowd, and more than one person seemed to shift uncomfortably under the scrutiny. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind already sifting through the fragments of the evening. The Sapphire's theft, she mused, had been carried out with remarkable precision. The timing, the darkness, the method, it all suggested a plan executed by someone well acquainted with such matters. But who, and why? She glanced toward Lord Ashbourne, who was pacing near the stage, his frustration barely contained. Lady Ashbourne sat rigid in her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling. Cordelia, standing nearby, stared at the empty case with wide, frightened eyes. And then there was Edward Pike. Where had he gone during the chaos, and what, if anything, had he seen? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, her expression serene. There was much to consider, and she had no doubt the answers would reveal themselves in time. For now she would do what she did best: observe, listen, and wait. As the ship's engines thrummed faintly beneath her feet, she couldn't help but feel a faint twinge of excitement. The game, it seemed, was afoot. The captain's private office was a modest yet tasteful retreat, a sharp contrast to the opulence of the SS Elysion. Polished wood panelling gleamed under the soft glow of a brass lamp, while nautical charts were neatly arranged on the walls, marking routes across oceans. A single porthole admitted the faint light of dawn, its glass fogged by the cool sea air. The faint, rhythmic hum of the ship's engines provided a constant backdrop, like a heartbeat. Miss Agatha Marple sat opposite Captain Townsend, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. Despite the warmth of the room, she had kept her gloves on, their crisp lines a quiet symbol of her unruffled composure. The captain, in contrast, leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on the desk, his expression grave. "Miss Marple," Townsend began, his tone measured, "you understand the predicament we're in." She tilted her head slightly, her expression serene but attentive. "I believe I do, Captain. A stolen sapphire of considerable value, a ship full of passengers with varying degrees of honesty, and the potential for a great deal of unpleasantness should word get out." Townsend allowed himself a faint smile. "You've a gift for concision, madam." "Yes, that sums it up rather neatly. The vanishing jewel of the Atlantic is not just a gem, it's a symbol. If the passengers learn it has disappeared, panic will spread faster than we can contain it. Worse, it would tarnish the reputation of this line, perhaps irreparably." Miss Marple nodded. "And of course, you've considered that the thief may already have plans to disembark with their prize when we reach New York." The captain's jaw tightened. "Exactly, which is why I need your help. Ship security will conduct their inquiries, of course, but—" He hesitated, his gaze fixed on her. "You have a reputation, Miss Marple, for seeing things others miss. I believe you could do a great deal to help us resolve this, quietly." Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing as she considered the request. "I must confess, Captain Townsend, that I came aboard this ship with the firm intention of taking a holiday from such matters. A restful voyage, free of mysteries, was all I had in mind." "I understand," Townsend said quickly, though his tone suggested he had anticipated her hesitation. "And I would not ask this of you lightly. But you've seen the reactions of the guests. each one a potential suspect, each one a potential victim of suspicion. An objective mind, unclouded by personal connections, could make all the difference. For a moment, Miss Marple said nothing, her gaze drifting to the porthole. The faint outline of the horizon was just visible, a pale line dividing sea and sky. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Very well, Captain, I shall do my best to assist, but I must insist on 2 conditions." "Name them." "First, discretion. The fewer people who know I am involved, the better. Second, complete freedom to follow my instincts. That means access to the passengers, the staff, and any information I deem relevant." Townsend nodded, his relief evident. "Agreed." Miss Marple rose, smoothing the front of her travelling suit. "In that case, I shall begin immediately. Time, as you've said, is not on our side." "Where will you start?" Townsend asked, rising as well. "With the basics," she replied. "Who had the opportunity, who had the motive, and most importantly, who seems to be trying just a little too hard to appear innocent?" The captain nodded thoughtfully. "If you need anything at all, my steward will assist you." "Thank you, Captain, and might I suggest you maintain an air of calm confidence among the passengers? A little reassurance can go a long way." Townsend managed a wry smile. "I'll do my best, though I suspect the passengers will be much calmer than Lord Ashbourne if we fail to recover his jewel." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile as she turned to leave. "Let us hope, Captain, that it does not come to that." As she stepped out of the captain's office and into the hushed corridor, Miss Marple paused for a moment, her gloved hands lightly clasped. The ship's corridors were waking slowly, the faint rustle of movement and the muted sound of voices filtering through the stillness. The grand salon, no doubt, was still abuzz with whispers and speculation. And somewhere on this ship, she thought, was a thief, perhaps already congratulating themselves on their daring. But Miss Marple had learnt long ago that even the cleverest schemes left traces. A word spoken in haste, a glance held too long, a detail overlooked. People always revealed themselves given time. Adjusting her hat with a practised motion, she began walking toward the salon, her steps unhurried but purposeful. There were facts to gather, patterns to discern, and, undoubtedly, secrets to uncover. And if there was one thing Miss Marple knew, it was that secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. The grand salon, which only hours ago had been alive with music, laughter, and champagne, now lay shrouded in uneasy silence. The velvet ropes that once framed the dazzling, vanishing jewel of the Atlantic now marked the boundary of a crime scene. The empty display case sat like a monument to humiliation and mystery, its glass panels streaked with faint smudges, its cushion barren. Miss Agatha Marple, with her unassuming air and precise movements, approached the display with a deliberate calm that belied the undercurrent of tension in the room. She carried herself with the dignity of a woman who did not believe in wasted steps or wasted words. Her gloved fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the glass as she peered at the lock. The broken lock was cleanly forced, no crude tool marks, no jagged edges, just a precise puncture where the mechanism had yielded to skill. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Clean as a whistle," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Not the work of an amateur?" Nearby a steward shifted nervously, clutching a small notepad and glancing repeatedly at the empty case. Miss Marple paid him no mind. Her focus remained on the lock and the faint smudges around the edges of the glass. She produced a handkerchief from her bag and dabbed at one of the marks, inspecting it with care. Behind her, Lady Edith Ashbourne sat stiffly on a gilded chair, her composure hanging by a thread. Her daughter Cordelia paced in restless circles, wringing her hands. The younger woman's movements were quick, almost frantic, as if she might burn off her anxiety through sheer motion. Finally, Cordelia stopped, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. "I wasn't there," she blurted out. "When the lights went out, I had stepped away. I wasn't near the display." Miss Marple turned, her expression mild. "Oh? And where had you gone, my dear?" Cordelia's face flushed. "I only went to the powder room just for a moment, but I know how it looks. I wasn't here to see what happened." Her mother's sharp intake of breath punctuated the statement. Lady Ashbourne, usually so poised, covered her face with one trembling hand. "Cordelia, please," she whispered. "This is not the time." But Cordelia pressed on, her voice rising. "I didn't take it, if that's what anyone thinks. I'd never—" She broke off, her voice cracking, and turned away, her shoulders trembling. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone remained measured. "No one is accusing you, my dear. These things often happen in a flurry of confusion. It's natural to feel anxious." Lady Ashbourne lowered her hands, her face pale. "You don't understand," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That sapphire, it wasn't just an heirloom. It was everything." A single tear traced its way down her cheek. "We cannot afford to lose it." The words hung in the air like a leaden weight, drawing Miss Marple's gaze back to the empty display case. The Ashbourne finances, she thought, were worse than society gossip had let on. Later, as Miss Marple exited the grand salon to collect her thoughts, she found herself in a dimly lit corridor leading toward the first-class cabins. The hum of conversation and the faint strains of the jazz trio's rehearsal drifted from the distance. She paused near an ornate wall sconce, her thoughts turning over the details she had observed so far. It was then that she noticed Edward Pike, the enigmatic gentleman she had observed earlier in the evening. He appeared suddenly as if he had materialized from the shadows, his footsteps soft on the plush carpet. His polished demeanour and sharp features gave him the air of a man accustomed to moving unnoticed. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said smoothly, inclining his head. "A curious business, isn't it?" Miss Marple studied him with a faint smile. "Indeed, Mr. Pike. One wonders what sort of mind could orchestrate such a thing." Pike's lips twitched as if suppressing a smile. "A bold one, certainly, though I suspect not entirely unfamiliar with the more delicate aspects of such work." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You sound as though you've given the matter some thought." He shrugged lightly. "Locks, mechanisms, security measures, they've always fascinated me. It's a bit of an intellectual puzzle, really, but I'm afraid I have no expertise beyond idle curiosity." "Idle curiosity," Miss Marple repeated, her tone as light as a feather. "And where, if I may ask, were you when the lights failed?" Pike's smile remained, though his eyes darkened slightly. "Ah, I knew that question would come. I'd stepped out for some air. The commotion didn't quite suit me." "How fortunate," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "to be spared the confusion." Pike's gaze held hers for a moment, then flicked away. "Indeed, though I imagine you'll unravel the mystery in no time, Miss Marple. You have the look of someone who sees far more than she lets on." "An old habit," she replied with a small laugh. As Pike excused himself and disappeared down the corridor, Miss Marple stood for a moment, her gloved hands resting lightly on her handbag. His movements had been practised, his words polished, but there was something about him that lingered in her mind. His casual reference to locks, the faint evasion in his tone, it all pointed to a man who knew more than he was willing to admit. And yet, Miss Marple thought, it was often the cleverest individuals who overplayed their hand. Whether Pike was truly involved or merely an observer of the chaos remained to be seen, but one thing was certain, he was not a man to be dismissed lightly. With a soft sigh, she adjusted her hat and continued down the corridor, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the evening. There were still too many questions, too many moving parts, but Miss Marple knew from experience that every puzzle, no matter how intricate, eventually revealed its solution. For now she would wait, watch, and listen. The truth, she was certain, would not remain hidden for long. The truth, Miss Agatha Marple mused, often lay hidden beneath layers of propriety and well-polished facades. It was a lesson she had learned long ago, and one that served her well now as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the SS Elysian, her sharp mind piecing together fragments of the unfolding mystery. The theft of the vanishing jewel of the Atlantic had cracked open more than a glass display case. It had revealed the fault lines in the lives of those aboard. The Ashbourne family's suite, located on the first-class deck, was a study in faded grandeur. Heavy drapes hung over the porthole, their edges frayed from years of wear. The antique furniture, though elegant, bore the marks of hasty transport, and a faint scent of lavender clung to the air, masking the underlying musk of disuse. Lord Henry Ashbourne stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid. His grey suit, impeccably tailored, now seemed ill-fitted against the lines of worry etched into his face. He had invited Miss Marple in with a politeness that bordered on reluctance, and now he watched her with a mix of apprehension and resignation. Miss Marple, seated in a well-worn armchair, observed him with her characteristic calm. "It is a delicate matter, Lord Ashbourne," she began, her voice soft but firm, "but one cannot help wondering why you chose to exhibit such a precious gem, knowing the risks." He stiffened, his fingers tightening around the glass of brandy in his hand. "I thought you were here to help recover the sapphire, not question my judgment." "I find," she replied, her tone almost apologetic, "that the two are often closely linked. Motive, opportunity, they rarely exist in isolation." Lord Ashbourne sighed heavily and turned away, staring out at the drawn curtains as though they offered some solace. "You must understand, Miss Marple, that the Ashbourne name, it carries weight, or at least it used to. And now—" He hesitated, his voice dropping to a murmur. "It is little more than a ghost of what it once was. The estate, the family fortune, all but gone. We are drowning in debt, clinging to the remnants of a reputation that no longer has any substance. Exhibiting the sapphire was an act of desperation, a chance to show strength, to attract investors, perhaps even secure a buyer." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "A buyer?" Lord Ashbourne turned, his face pale. "Yes," he admitted. "I'd considered selling it. There was interest. An anonymous party who contacted me discreetly. But I swear to you, Miss Marple, I never agreed to it. I never would have arranged for it to be stolen." His voice broke slightly, and he sank into a nearby chair, running a hand over his face. "That gem was our last hope. Without it, I fear there's nothing left." Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone gentle but probing. "Desperation, Lord Ashbourne, can make even the most honourable men vulnerable to manipulation. Are you certain that no one knew of your intentions? A servant, a friend, someone you might have confided in?" He shook his head, but his hesitation spoke volumes. "No. At least, I didn't tell anyone outright. But these things have a way of getting out. People talk." Miss Marple nodded, rising to her feet. "Thank you, Lord Ashbourne. You've been most helpful." As she stepped toward the door, she paused, her gloved hand resting lightly on the handle. "One last thing, if I may. The anonymous party, did they contact you directly?" He hesitated, then nodded. "A letter, delivered to my cabin the morning we set sail. It suggested a meeting, but I destroyed it." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "How very prudent." Her mind churned as she stepped out of the suite, leaving Lord Ashbourne to his thoughts. The Ashbourne legacy, she realized, was not just crumbling. It was on the brink of collapse, and desperation, as she well knew, was a fertile ground for cunning thieves. The lower decks of the ship were a stark contrast to the glittering salons above. Narrow passageways wound through dimly lit spaces, the air thick with the scent of oil and seawater. The steady thrum of the engines was louder here, vibrating through the walls and floors like a distant heartbeat. Miss Marple's footsteps echoed softly as she made her way toward the cargo hold. It was a place few passengers ventured, but she had learned long ago that answers were often found in the least expected corners. As she turned a corner, she nearly collided with a steward slumped against the wall. He was young, his face pale and drawn, with a dark bruise blossoming along his cheekbone. His uniform was rumpled and his hands trembled as he tried to steady himself. "Oh dear," Miss Marple said, her voice laced with concern. "You've had a rough time of it, haven't you?" The steward looked up, startled, then winced as he straightened. I'm fine, ma'am. Just a bit of an accident." "Accident?" she echoed, her tone light but her gaze sharp. "That bruise doesn't look accidental to me." He hesitated, then sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I suppose there's no use hiding it. I was down by the cargo hold, checking inventory, when someone jumped me, a man in a first-class suit. He didn't say a word, just shoved me aside and went rummaging through the crates." "Rummaging?" Miss Marple prompted, her curiosity piqued. "For what?" "I don't know," the steward admitted, his voice shaking. But he was in a hurry, like he was looking for something specific. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And did you see where he went? No, ma'am. But the time I got up, he was gone. But I know this much. He wasn't one of the crew. He was a passenger. The steward winced again, clutching his side. Miss Marple reached out, steadying him with a firm hand. Come along, she said briskly. You need the infirmary, and I suspect you'll feel better after a rest. As they made their way back up the passageway, Miss Marple's mind raced. A passenger in the cargo hold, searching through crates, likely for contraband, or a stolen sapphire. The timing, the secrecy, the violence. It all pointed to a bold and dangerous plan. She helped the steward into the care of a ship's nurse, then stepped back into the corridor, her expression thoughtful. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but the picture they formed was still unclear. Somewhere aboard this ship, a thief was hiding in plain sight, and Miss Marple intended to find them before they could strike again. The corridor outside the infirmary was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of medical apparatus filtering through the closed door. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mingling with the oil and salt that permeated the ship's lower decks. Miss Agatha Marple, having just left the injured steward in the capable hands of the doctor, paused for a moment to adjust her gloves and gather her thoughts. It was then that she noticed him, Edward Pike, leaning nonchalantly against the wall a short distance away. His sharp features were partially obscured by the shadow cast by a nearby sconce, but there was no mistaking the calculated ease in his posture. He was loitering, though his carefully indifferent expression suggested he would claim otherwise if pressed. Miss Marple stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Mr. Pike," she said lightly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to mask the steel beneath. "How curious to find you here." Pike looked up, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, always a pleasure to cross paths with you, though I fear this particular corridor is rather less picturesque than most." Her gaze remained steady. "Indeed, it does make one wonder why you'd choose to linger." He shrugged, the movement casual, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something less certain. "One can't help but notice a bit of commotion, even on a ship as grand as the Elysian. I thought I might lend a hand, should it be needed." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene, but her mind working quickly. "How kind of you, Mr. Pike. Though I must say your habit of appearing at moments of intrigue is intriguing in itself." Pike chuckled softly, though the sound lacked genuine mirth. "You flatter me, Miss Marple. I assure you my movements are quite ordinary. If anything, I seem to have a knack for stumbling into the wrong place at the wrong time." "Or the right place," Miss Marple countered, her tone still mild. "Depending on one's perspective." Pike's smile tightened. "You're implying something, I think." "Pray don't be coy." Miss Marple adjusted her handbag, her gaze unwavering. "I wouldn't dream of it, but one can't help but notice a pattern. You were present at the gala, quite near the display case before the sapphire vanished, and now here you are, in the corridor outside the infirmary, shortly after a steward reports an encounter with a mysterious first-class passenger rummaging through the cargo hold." He raised an eyebrow, feigning amusement. "A remarkable coincidence, I'll admit, but surely you're not suggesting that I'm involved in such nefarious activities?" "I rarely suggest," Miss Marple said, her tone light as air. "I observe." Pike's smile faded slightly, his expression hardening just enough to suggest irritation. "You're quite the observer, Miss Marple, though I wonder if your observations might lead you astray this time." "Possibly," she conceded, "though I do find it curious that you've yet to offer a proper explanation for your presence here." He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If you must know, I have my own reasons for being on this ship. Official reasons." Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. "Official, you say?" Pike straightened, his easy demeanour slipping back into place. "I'm afraid I can't divulge much more than that. Suffice it to say, I'm here on business of a sensitive nature." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "How fascinating," she said at last. "And how convenient." Pike gave a low chuckle. though there was no humour in it. You're quite the formidable lady, Miss Marple. I can see why Captain Townsend values your insight, but I'd advise caution. Some matters are best left to those equipped to handle them." With that, he inclined his head in a polite but deliberate farewell and began to walk away, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Miss Marple watched him until he turned the corner, her mind already dissecting their exchange. As the corridor fell silent once more, Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the closed infirmary door. Pike's cryptic remark about official business lingered in her mind, raising more questions than it answered. Who was he, truly? And what sort of agenda might he be pursuing under the guise of a charming yet elusive gentleman? The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, but one thing was becoming clear. Pike was no ordinary passenger, whether ally or adversary. He had inserted himself into the mystery with a precision that suggested purpose. And if Miss Marple had learned anything over the years, it was that purpose, hidden or otherwise, always left a trail. Adjusting her hat, she turned and made her way back toward the upper decks, her thoughts sharp and focused. There were still many questions to be answered, and the clock was ticking. But one thing was certain: Edward Pike was a thread worth pulling. The promenade deck was a different world at night. Gone was the daytime bustle of promenading passengers and light-hearted conversations. In its place was a quiet stillness, broken only by the soft lapping of waves against the ship's hull and the faint whistle of the wind. The moon hung low, casting its silvery light across the dark waters, and the ship's rails gleamed like polished steel in the glow. Miss Agatha Marple walked with a deliberate calm, her footsteps muffled against the deck's polished wood. She had spotted Edward Pike earlier, lingering near the ship's rail with an air of practised indifference. Now, as she approached, he straightened slightly, though his hands remained loosely clasped behind his back. His silhouette, sharp against the moonlit sea, radiated a confidence that Miss Marple found both intriguing and suspect. "Mr. Pike," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough weight to command his attention. He turned, his face slipping into a faint smile. "Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure! Couldn't sleep?" "I find that mysteries have a way of keeping the mind occupied," she replied. "And yours, I think, is one worth untangling." Pike's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I'm not sure I follow." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple said, her tone light but pointed. She stepped closer, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. "You've taken great care to blend in, Mr. Pike, but I suspect you are no ordinary passenger. A man of your talents seldom is." For a moment Pike said nothing. The wind tugged at his coat, and he turned his gaze back to the sea as if debating his next move. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, the polished edge giving way to something more genuine. "You're sharper than most, Miss Marple, I'll give you that. I find people often underestimate the value of observation," she replied. "Now, shall we dispense with the pretense?" Pike exhaled softly, his shoulders relaxing as though a burden had been lifted. "You're right, of course. I'm not just here to enjoy the voyage. My name is Edward Pike, yes, but I'm also a Pinkerton detective." "A Pinkerton," Miss Marple murmured, tilting her head. "How fascinating! And what, pray, brings you aboard the Elysium?" Pike hesitated, then gestured toward the empty stretch of deck. "Perhaps we'd best not discuss this in plain sight." Miss Marple inclined her head and followed him to a shadowed alcove near the ship's side. There, with the moonlight gleaming on the waves behind them, he began to speak. "I'm here on assignment," Pike admitted. "There's been chatter for months about an international smuggling ring operating out of Europe. Rare gems, stolen artifacts, you name it. Word is, one of the ringleaders is aboard this ship. Someone high enough in the organization to handle major transactions." "The Ashburns?" Miss Marple prompted, her voice calm but her gaze sharp. Pike's jaw tightened. "At first I thought they might be involved. The rumors about their finances, the sudden decision to exhibit the sapphire, too many coincidences. It wouldn't have been the first time a family on the brink staged a theft to collect insurance or sell the item discreetly through less savory channel." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "An understandable suspicion, given the circumstances, but now—" Pike trailed off, shaking his head. "I've been watching them closely, and I'm not so sure anymore. Lord Ashbourne doesn't strike me as a man with the stomach for that kind of risk. Desperation, maybe, but outright criminal behaviour? I'm less convinced." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "you've remained watchful." Pike's gaze met hers. "Because someone aboard this ship is involved. The smuggling ring's network is too vast for this to be coincidence. The Saphire disappearing the way it did, that wasn't a simple theft. It was professional, clean. Someone aboard this ship had the skill and the motive." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "It seems, Mr. Pike, that we share a common goal, recovering the jewel. However, our methods may differ." Pike gave a wry smile. "I imagine yours are a bit more delicate." "I find delicacy often yields more information than force," she said, her tone tinged with dry humour. "But I do appreciate a well-placed nudge when necessary." He chuckled, though his eyes remained serious. "I'll admit, Miss Marple, your reputation precedes you. I'd heard about you before this voyage. Quiet, unassuming, but razor-sharp. I suppose I should count myself lucky you're not after me." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Luck, Mr. Pike, is often a matter of perception." They stood in silence for a moment, the faint sound of the waves filling the space between them. Finally, Pike straightened, his polished demeanour slipping back into place. "I'll let you get back to your sleuthing, Miss Marple. Just know this, the thief we're after is clever and dangerous." "Cleverness, I find, often trips over its own feet," she replied. "As for danger, I've long since learned to mind my step." Pike inclined his head. "Good night, Miss Marple. Good night, Mr. Pike." As he disappeared into the shadows, Miss Marple turned her gaze back to the sea, her mind already piecing together the threads of what she had learned. Pike's confession added a new layer to the mystery, one that hinted at a web of intrigue far larger than a single stolen gem. But whether he was ally or adversary remained to be seen, for now she had one certainty. The Elysian was a ship teeming with secrets, and the truth lay somewhere in its shadowy corridors, waiting to be uncovered. The lounge library was a haven of calm amidst the simmering tension aboard the SS Elysian. Its polished wood panelling and well-stocked shelves spoke of refinement, while the distant hum of the ship's engines provided a soothing undercurrent. An ornate clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking the passage of time with an almost hypnotic precision. Miss Agatha Marple sat at a small writing desk near the corner, a stack of old shipping records spread out before her. Edward Pike leaned over the desk, his usually composed demeanour tinged with irritation as he flipped through a ledger. "These records are a maze," he muttered, his finger trailing down a column of numbers. "If there's a connection to the smuggling operation, it's buried under layers of bureaucracy." Miss Marple, her expression serene, adjusted her glasses and scanned a page with meticulous care. "Patience, Mr. Pike. Mysteries rarely unravel themselves all at once. It's the little threads that matter." The sound of the library door opening interrupted them. Miss Cordelia Ashbourne stepped inside, her pale face framed by the dim glow of the room's lamps. Her eyes, red-rimmed and brimming with unshed tears, met Miss Marple's, and she hesitated before walking toward the desk. I'm sorry to intrude," Cordelia began, her voice unsteady. "I didn't know where else to go." Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. "You're not intruding, my dear. What troubles you?" Cordelia sank into a nearby chair, twisting her gloved hands in her lap. "It's my father," she said after a moment. "You need to know the truth. About why we're here. About the Sapphire." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Pike, who closed the ledger and crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "My father's debts aren't just from poor investments or extravagance," Cordelia continued, her voice trembling. "He's been blackmailed." "Blackmailed?" Pike repeated sharply. Cordelia nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It started years ago. He made some questionable deals, desperate attempts to save the estate, but those deals were with dangerous people tied to the liquor trade in America. When Prohibition hit, they saw an opportunity to exploit him. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze steady. "And these associates? Are they connected to anyone aboard this ship?" Cordelia hesitated. "I don't know, but I'm certain of one thing. None of us had anything to do with the sapphires' theft. I swear it. We may be desperate, but we would never—" She broke off, covering her face with her hands. After a moment she looked up, her voice pleading. "Please, Miss Marple, Mr. Pike, don't turn us in. If this gets out, my family will be ruined." Miss Marple reached across the desk and patted Cordelia's hand. "You've been very brave, my dear, and very honest. I promise you, my aim is to uncover the truth, not to cause harm." Cordelia nodded, her expression one of gratitude and despair. As she rose to leave, Pike watched her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. When the door closed behind her, he turned to Miss Marple. "You believe her?" he asked. Miss Marple removed her glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. "I believe she's telling the truth, as she knows it. But the Ashbourne desperation is a fertile ground for manipulation. Whoever stole that sapphire knew precisely how to exploit their circumstances." After Cordelia's departure, Miss Marple and Pike moved to a nearby reading alcove, its upholstered chairs arranged beneath a porthole that framed the moonlit sea. The alcove, though unoccupied, felt heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. Pike slumped into one of the chairs, rubbing his temples. "This case is a tangle of dead ends. Every suspect has a motive, but none of them fit cleanly. And if the thief's planning a handoff at the next port, we're running out of time." Miss Marple, seated across from him, folded her hands neatly in her lap. "The break-in to the display case was too precise to be the work of an amateur," she said. "Whoever orchestrated this had experience and resources." Pike looked up, frowning. "Then we're dealing with a professional. Smuggling rings often have fences in place to move stolen goods. The Sapphire could be halfway to Europe by the time we dock. Or," Miss Marple said softly, "still aboard, waiting for the right moment. Timing, Mr. Pike, is everything in such matters." Pike exhaled, frustration etched into his features. "And yet we have no solid leads. The Ashbournes, Pike's criminal network, the steward's mysterious attacker. It's all too fragmented." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Fragmented, yes, but not without pattern. Tell me, Mr. Pike, who benefits most from the Ashbournes' ruin?" Pike blinked. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm, "that the theft was not merely opportunistic. It was calculated. Someone aboard this ship stands to gain more than money from the Ashbournes' downfall. We must consider the possibility of a larger scheme." Pike sat back, his brow furrowed. "You think the theft was a setup, a way to frame the Ashbournes?" "It's a possibility we cannot ignore," she replied, "which is why we must widen our net. Look not just at the obvious suspects, but at those who seem too conveniently uninvolved. And we must revisit the cargo hold. I suspect it has more to tell us than we realize." The ornate clock in the library chimed softly, marking the hour. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her movements unhurried but purposeful. "Come along, Mr. Pike. The answers we seek are rarely found in broad daylight. Shadows, I find, often hold the sharpest truths." Pike followed her, his frustration giving way to determination. Together they left the alcove, their steps echoing softly as they disappeared into the ship's labyrinthine corridors, ready to chase the elusive threads of a mystery that refused to stay still. The darkness of the cargo hold was oppressive, the air heavy with the scent of oil and damp wood. Crates and luggage were stacked in precarious towers, casting long, jagged shadows under the flickering electric bulbs that lined the ceiling. Every creak of the ship and distant hum of machinery seemed amplified in the quiet, creating an atmosphere ripe for... Miss Agatha Marple descended the narrow stairs with measured steps, her sensible shoes making only the faintest sound against the metal. Behind her, Edward Pike moved with a practiced silence, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. A young crewman, recruited by Pike under the guise of routine inventory, followed nervously, clutching a small flashlight that cast a jittery beam across the hold. "Keep the light steady, if you please," Miss Marple said softly, her voice calm but firm. The crewman nodded, swallowing audibly as he directed the beam toward a row of crates marked with faded shipping labels. "Do you truly think the gem could be hidden down here?" Pike asked in a low voice, his tone skeptical. Miss Marple didn't look up from the crate she was examining. "If I were a thief, Mr. Pike, I would choose a location as overlooked as this. Besides," she added, brushing her gloved hand over a dusty label, "the cargo hold is not without its secrets." They worked methodically, prying open crates and inspecting their contents. Most were mundane: sacks of grain, wooden boxes filled with fine china, and passengers' excess luggage. But then, near the far wall, Pike froze. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, motioning her over. Inside the crate he'd opened was a half-burned scrap of paper. The writing was smudged, but the words, "Deal, New York," and "Safe Transit Guaranteed," were still legible. Miss Marple took the paper delicately, her eyes narrowing as she studied it. "Interesting," she murmured. "And look here." She pointed to a strange insignia stamped on the side of the crate, an ornate crest featuring a serpent coiled around a key. Pike's expression darkened. "That's the mark of a known smuggling ring operating out of Europe. They've been connected to stolen gems before." Before they could discuss further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. The crewman's flashlight wavered as he looked around, his face pale with fear. "Quickly!" Miss Marple whispered, motioning toward a shadowed alcove behind a stack of crates. The three of them slipped into the narrow space, just as the footsteps grew louder. A figure entered the hold, moving with purpose. The man's features were obscured by the low light, but his movements were precise, his focus singular. He rummaged through a nearby stack of crates, his hands deftly prying open one lid after another. After several tense minutes, he cursed under his breath and strode away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Miss Marple waited a moment before emerging from the alcove. Her expression was calm, but her eyes gleamed with quiet determination. "Whoever that was," she said, brushing dust from her coat, "they're searching for something, and I dare say it's not grain." The Ashbourne suite, once a symbol of refinement, now bore the signs of strain. Papers cluttered the desk, the air was heavy with worry, and the once pristine drapes hung unevenly, as though hastily drawn and forgotten. Lord Henry Ashbourne sat in a high-backed chair, his hands gripping the armrests, while Lady Edith Ashbourne paced the room, her face pale and drawn. Miss Marple entered quietly, her presence unassuming, yet commanding. "I wonder if we might have a word, Lord Ashbourne," she said. "There are matters that require clarification." He gestured weakly toward a chair. "Ask what you will, Miss Marple. I imagine there's little left to hide." Miss Marple sat, her posture straight. "The private buyer you mentioned. It would be helpful to know the details of your arrangement." Lord Ashbourne hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "It was a mistake," he admitted. "A desperate gamble. A man approached me shortly after we boarded. He said he'd heard whispers of our financial troubles. He offered to purchase the sapphire discreetly. The price was low, insultingly so, but I had no choice." "And you trusted him?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Not entirely," he confessed, "but he claimed he could save us from ruin, and I believed I had no other options." Lady Ashbourne stopped pacing, her voice trembling with anger. "You never told me this, Henry. How could you?" He looked at her, his face lined with regret. "Because I knew you'd forbid it. And now it seems he's stolen it outright." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes keen. "If this man is who I suspect, Lord Ashbourne, then he's not merely a buyer, he's a thief. A professional one, by the looks of it." Lord Ashbourne's expression crumbled. "What have I done?" he murmured. "My foolishness has cost us everything." "Not everything," Miss Marple said softly. "Not yet." The lounge bar was quiet, its usual hum of conversation replaced by the soft clink of glasses being polished by the bartender. The room's dim lighting and deep leather chairs created an air of intimacy, though the tension between its two occupants was anything but. Edward Pike leaned forward, his elbows resting on the small table between him and Miss Marple. "I've been digging into the man Lord Ashbourne described," he said in a low voice. "The alias matches someone on our radar, a smuggler known as Felix Moreau. He's been linked to several thefts across Europe, always operating under different names." "And you believe he's aboard this ship?" Miss Marple asked. Pike nodded. "It fits. The Sapphire's disappearance, the note in the cargo hold, the smuggling insignia, it's all too coincidental. Moreau likely staged the theft himself, intending to sell the gem in New York." Miss Marple tapped a finger lightly against the table, her expression thoughtful. "It's possible, but if Moreau is as clever as you suggest, he'll know we're closing in. We'll need to set a trap." Pike raised an eyebrow. "A trap?" "Indeed," she said, "one that will force him to reveal himself. But we must act quickly. If the Saphire leaves this ship, recovering it will be far more difficult." Pike leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've got something in mind, haven't you?" Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "I find, Mr. Pike, that clever thieves often underestimate cleverer detectives. Let us hope that holds true." As the bartender cleared their table, Miss Marple and Pike exchanged a determined glance. The game was far from over, and the next move would be theirs. The first light of dawn crept through the porthole in the captain's office, casting long shadows across the room's polished brass fittings and dark oak furniture. The faint hum of the ship's engines provided a steady undertone, broken only by the low murmur of voices. Miss Agatha Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her hands neatly folded on her lap. Across the desk, Captain Townsend leaned forward, his expression a mix of wariness and resolve. Edward Pike stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the pale morning light. "This is highly irregular," Townsend said, his voice heavy with concern. "Leaking false information to passengers, it could create unnecessary panic. I understand your hesitations, Captain," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm but firm. "But this is a calculated risk. If we wait for the thief to act on their own terms, we may never recover the Saphire. By feeding them a plausible story, we can control the narrative." "And lure them into the open." Pike nodded, his arms crossed. "Marple's right. We know the thief is aboard, and we know they're desperate to secure the gem. If they believe the Ashbournes are hiding additional valuables, they'll have no choice but to act." Townsend sighed, rubbing his temples. "And you're certain this will work?" "No plan is without its uncertainties," Miss Marple said gently. "But I've always found that desperation reveals true intentions." The captain leaned back in his chair, his gaze flickering between the two of them. Finally he nodded. "Very well, but I want this handled discreetly. No alarms, no unnecessary risks." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, Captain." Pike straightened. "We'll spread the rumour subtly, just enough for the right ears to catch wind of it, and we'll be ready when they take the bait." As the meeting concluded, Townsend rose to see them out. "Good luck," he said quietly, "for all our sakes." Miss Marple offered him a faint smile. "Luck, Captain, is simply preparation meeting opportunity." The lounge was a picture of subdued elegance. Low lighting cast warm hues over the room, reflecting off polished brass fixtures and soft leather armchairs. A handful of passengers lingered, their murmured conversations blending with the faint strains of the ship's orchestra drifting from the next room. Miss Marple sat near a curtained alcove, her knitting resting idly in her lap. She appeared every bit the unassuming spinster, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. Across the room, Pike leaned casually against the bar, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his posture relaxed but his gaze alert. At the centre of the scene, Lord Ashbourne played his part admirably. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he engaged in a staged conversation with an acquaintance, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard. "Of course, the family valuables are quite secure," Ashbourne said, his tone deliberately nonchalant. "One must take precautions with such treasures, especially in times like these." The words hung in the air like bait, and Miss Marple noted with satisfaction the slight shift in the demeanour of one of the nearby passengers. A tall man with a carefully trimmed moustache, and the man hesitated, then approached Lord Ashbourne. "Excuse me, Lord Ashbourne," he said smoothly, his accent faintly French. "I couldn't help overhearing your mention of family valuables. Might I inquire further?" Ashbourne gave him a polite smile. "Ah, monsieur. Moreau," the man supplied with a faint bow. "Felix Moreau." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled, though she remained outwardly placid. Pike, too, stiffened slightly, his grip tightening on his glass. Ashbourne gestured for Moreau to sit, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Of course, Monsieur Moreau. What is it you wish to know?" Moreau's smile was thin, his eyes gleaming. "Merely a professional interest, Lord Ashbourne. You see, I am something of a connoisseur of rare treasures, and I couldn't help but wonder if your family's collection might include certain unique items." As he spoke, Pike moved subtly closer, his casual demeanour masking the tension in his stance. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on Moreau, her sharp mind piecing together the man's every word and movement. Moreau leaned in slightly, his tone growing more insistent. "If you were willing to part with such items, I could ensure they find appropriate buyers. Discreetly, of course." At that moment Miss Marple gave a subtle signal. A slight tilt of her head. Pike moved swiftly, placing a firm hand on Moreau's shoulder. "I think that's enough, Moreau," Pike said, his voice low and dangerous. Moreau's eyes widened briefly before narrowing. "Hey, what is this?" "You've been caught," Pike said calmly. "We know who you are, and we know what you've done. Now, let's not make this difficult." Moreau's expression shifted, and for a moment he seemed poised to bolt. But before he could act, Pike tightened his grip, and two discreetly placed ship stewards stepped forward, blocking the exits. Realizing escape was impossible, Moreau's demeanour changed. He slumped back into his chair, his polished facade cracking. "You have no proof," he said sullenly. "Perhaps not yet," Miss Marple said, finally speaking. Her tone was light but carried an unmistakable authority. "But you've revealed enough. Your interest in the Ashbournes, your presence in the cargo hold, the timing of your inquiries, it all fits together rather neatly." Moreau smirked. "Even if you've caught me, you'll never find the sapphire." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "Oh, but we will, because I suspect you've hidden it somewhere aboard this ship, somewhere only you would think to look." Moreau's silence was telling, and Miss Marple rose from her seat, her expression resolute. "Time, as they say, is of the essence, and I dare say we have a few more moves to make before this game is through." The cargo hold was a different place in full light. Lanterns swung from hooks along the low ceiling, casting bright but uneven beams over the towering crates and scattered tools. Shadows danced along the walls, but there was none of the oppressive gloom that had dominated during their earlier search. Now the air buzzed with tension and anticipation. Miss Agatha Marple, her expression calm as ever, stood at the centre of it all. Beside her, Edward Pike crossed his arms, his stance tense but ready. Two crew members, lanterns in hand, hovered nearby, awaiting instructions. At the far end of the hold, the detained smuggler, Felix Moreau, sat slouched on a wooden crate, his hands bound. A ship's guard stood behind him, his posture rigid. "Well, Monsieur Moreau," Miss Marple said lightly, her voice cutting through the stillness, "you've brought us this far. Surely you'd like to demonstrate some measure of good faith." Moreau sneered, his moustache twitching as he leaned forward. "Good faith? You insult me, madame. Very well. The sapphire, it's here, hidden in one of the crates marked with the serpent and key insignia." "Conveniently vague," Pike muttered. "There are dozens of crates down here." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone placid. "But the truth is rarely as hidden as it seems. Shall we begin?" The crew members sprang into action, prying open crates and inspecting their contents. Crates of textiles, bottles of wine, and even a cache of counterfeit documents emerged, but none held the gleaming prize they sought. After nearly an hour, Pike's patience wore thin. "We're running in circles," he said, his voice tight. "Are you enjoying wasting our time, Moreau?" Moreau smirked, but said nothing. Miss Marple, who had been quietly studying the crates, suddenly stepped forward. "There!" she said, pointing to a crate wedged between two larger ones. Its markings matched the smuggling insignia, but it also bore a faint scuff near its corner, a detail that had escaped the others. "Help me with this," Pike said, motioning to the crew. The crate was dragged forward and carefully pried open. Inside was an assortment of seemingly ordinary items, books, linens, and decorative trinkets. Pike groaned in frustration, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes lingered on the interior. "There," she said, tapping the wooden base. "It's false. Pry it up." The crewman obeyed, sliding his crowbar under the panel. With a crack, the false bottom came loose, revealing a small velvet pouch nestled within. Pike reached in and opened the pouch, his breath catching. Inside, the sapphire gleamed, its deep blue facets catching the lantern light and refracting it into a kaleidoscope of brilliance. "The vanishing jewel of the Atlantic," Pike said, his voice low. "Intact." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "And quite the journey it's had." Moreau, watching from his crate, gave a bitter laugh. "Well done, madam, but I wonder, will the Ashbournes appreciate your efforts or curse you for saving their folly?" Miss Marple's expression didn't waver. "The answer to that, Monsieur Moreau, is none of your concern." As Moreau was escorted out under guard, Pike turned to Marple. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. But I suspect this isn't over yet." She adjusted her hat. "Oh, it rarely is. But for now, the jewel is safe, and that is what matters." The captain's office, bathed in soft afternoon light, felt almost serene after the chaos of the cargo hold. Lord and Lady Ashbourne sat side by side, their faces etched with weariness and shame. Cordelia, standing behind them, wrung her hands nervously. Miss Marple placed the velvet pouch on the desk. "Your sapphire, Lord Ashbourne." The room fell silent as the family stared at the recovered gem. Finally, Lady Ashbourne reached for it, her voice trembling. It's really back." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her tone kind but firm. "But I fear its recovery does not solve your larger troubles." Lord Ashbourne sank into his chair, his face pale. "You've every right to lecture me, Miss Marple. My recklessness nearly destroyed us." "I have no intention of lecturing," she replied, "but I will say this. Honesty is often the first step toward redemption. If you truly wish to save your family, you must face your debts and make amends. Discretion and dignity need not be mutually exclusive." Cordelia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Miss Marple is right. We've spent too long pretending everything is fine, hiding behind jewels and estates. It's time we faced reality and fixed what we can." Lady Ashbourne turned to her daughter, tears brimming in her eyes. "But how, Cordelia? Where do we even begin?" "Together," Cordelia said firmly, "and without secrets." Miss Marple stood, adjusting her gloves. "Wise words, Miss Ashbourne. I dare say your family is fortunate to have you." As she left the room, the faint glimmer of hope in their eyes was enough to satisfy her. They had a long road ahead, but the first step had been taken. The deck of the SS Elysian gleamed in the morning sunlight, the silhouette of New York's skyline growing clearer with each passing moment. Skyscrapers rose like giants from the horizon, their glass windows catching the light and throwing it back toward the sea. Miss Marple stood at the rail, her expression serene as she watched the harbour draw closer. Beside her, Pike leaned casually, his coat flapping lightly in the breeze. "Well," he said, "another case closed, though I must admit you make it look easier than it is." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not easier, Mr. Pike, just quieter." Pike chuckled. "Perhaps. I couldn't have done this without you, though. Have you ever considered a more formal role in this line of work?" She gave him a knowing look. "I'm quite content as I am, thank you. Besides, I'm just a retired lady with a fondness for puzzles." "Puzzles you solve better than most professionals," Pike said. "But I'll let you keep your secrets." The ship slowed as it approached the dock, the sounds of the bustling city filtering up to meet them. Pike straightened. "Well, I've got a smuggler to hand over to the authorities, and you, I suspect, have mysteries of your own to ponder." Always, Miss Marple said with a smile. As Pike descended the gangway, she remained at the rail, watching the city come alive. The Sapphire was safe, the culprit apprehended, and justice, in its way, had been served. For now, that was enough. With a final glance at the horizon, she turned and stepped off the ship, disappearing into the crowd with the quiet grace of someone who had once again brought order to chaos.